the Bible, the Quran, the Book of Mormon, Dianetics, the Vedas, the book which tells the truth. There are a number of books out there which all purport to one degree or another to be the revelatory answer to the question of our origins. In America, the one which garners the most attention and whose followers demand that we show it the most respect is the Holy Bible. This particular book claims to tell us how the universe came to be, how we came to be, and what our purpose is. It claims to be the source of morality. It claims to describe an afterlife. It claims that rejection of its proposals will result in eternal damnation in a place of abject torture. The followers of this book are Christians, and they fall into two basic camps. You have Bible literalists, and you have those who consider the early stories of the book to be less factual and more metaphorical. It's this latter group that I hope to address in this discussion. Jesus said some remarkable things in the Bible. "Whatsoever you do to the least of my brothers, that you do unto me. Turn the other cheek. Do unto others as you would have done unto you." He said some specific theological things that, even if untrue, are not bad things to believe. It's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Render unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and render unto God those things which are God's. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. He also said a few questionable things as well. "For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. I came not to send peace, but a sword. For every one that asketh receiveth, and he that seeketh findeth, and to him that knocketh it shall be opened." For the believer, I can fully understand the desire to follow a man who said things so wise in some cases, and so open to wise interpretation in other instances. But the question remains, are the claims made about Jesus justified or justifiable? In order to be a Christian, it's not enough to agree with some of the wisdom of Jesus. If it was, I'd be a Christian. I'd also be a Mohammedan, a Confucianist, and a Buddhist. No, to be a Christian, one must at a minimum accept the biblical claims about the divinity of Jesus and the extra-biblical claims about Satan, the Trinity, and the threat of damnation. So the questions are, is it reasonable to believe that Jesus was the Messiah, that he fulfills prophecy, that he was resurrected and ascended bodily into heaven, that he sits in judgment, that he was the human embodiment of the one divine God? Well, all of these claims are dependent on the biblical account being accurate. However, many Christians, as I have already noted, reject the accounts in Genesis. There's certainly good reason to reject the Genesis accounts. The story of creation cannot be literally true. The world was not created in 6 days. Adam was not the first man. The couple was not expelled from Eden for eating a fruit. Other Genesis stories also fail rational scrutiny. There was never a global flood. There's no firmament. Language was not confounded due to hubris. So it's reasonable to reject a literal interpretation of these stories and to view them rather as part of a grand narrative. But what happens to the book as a whole when we deny the legitimacy of a literal interpretation of these stories? Let's find out. One by one, let's examine the things which must be true of Jesus for him to be the Messiah, in a context where the Genesis accounts are simply metaphorical, and see if the foundation for Jesus' claims, truly the foundations for Christianity itself, hold metaphorical water. In Hebrew tradition, Messiahs were kings from the line of David. To that end, Jesus was called a king by his followers, although Christian tradition says he was a carpenter, and the Bible calls him a rabbi. It's also written that angels came to Mary and told her that Jesus would be a king. As for the Davidic line requirement, 2 separate Gospels of the New Testament give lineages back to David through his adoptive father Joseph. Yes, the genealogies contradict one another, and yes, Jesus supposedly shares no blood with Joseph, so the conflicting genetic lines are moot besides. But all of this is off the point of this video, so we'll ignore those problems for the time being. The question is, can the rejection of a factual basis for Genesis disavow the messianic claims attributed to Jesus? Well, as it happens, the concept of a Messiah relies on the Hebrew belief that God told Moses to anoint those chosen to be kings. Messiah literally means anointed one. In fact, God tells Moses to anoint the chosen kings with frankincense and myrrh, amongst other spices, and to do so in a gold-gilded tabernacle. This anointing requirement for messiahs is the basis for the nativity story of the 3 kings. So we see that the story of the Exodus is the foundation for the belief in a Messiah. The belief that God chose the Hebrews and led them with Moses to a land of milk and honey is based in the covenant entered into with Abraham by a God who favored Abraham amongst all of the descendants of Noah. That covenant comes after a history of begats, which flows backward from Abraham through Noah all the way back to Adam. Ultimately, if we reject Genesis, then we lose the validity of the covenant. Losing the covenant, we lose the reason God instructs Moses to anoint kings, and the very basis of the concept of Messiah is lost as well. In short, no Genesis, no Messiah. There's a timeline in the book of Genesis which begins with the six-day creation and then follows through to Abraham, and from Abraham into Exodus, and from Exodus into the book of Judges, and so on, all the way up to David and beyond. The New Testament then picks up the timeline, as I've already noted, giving two contradictory lineages from David to Jesus. This is done because we are told that the Messiah will be from the house of David. The Old Testament also says several other things about the Messiah which must be true if Jesus is to be considered the one foretold. We're told that he will be from Bethlehem. We're told that at a certain time he will ride a donkey. Some interpretations claim that we're told that his mother will be a virgin. Jesus, we are told, uniquely fulfills all of these prophecies. There's a lot that could be said about this claim. For example, it could be pointed out that several of the so-called prophecies are not prophecies at all. Some of the things we are told are prophecies are actually just stories about people already mentioned in the Old Testament, such as Samson and Daniel. In other cases, the fulfilled prophecies are not satisfied by the Jesus narrative because of mistakes of transliteration, such as confusing the word Nazarite for the word Nazarene. Yet does any of this really matter? We've already seen that the Messiah concept relies on the Genesis account. So doesn't that mean that prophecies about the Messiah rely on the Genesis account as well? In fact, the book of Matthew actually begins with the words, "The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham." Additionally, isn't the validity of any prophecies found in a book with a collapsed foundation also called into question? For example, some of the supposed fulfilled prophecies come from the book of Psalms. Psalms is attributed to David, but David's claim to validity is based in his having been anointed. Moreover, let's just take one of those prophecies and examine it distinct from the issue of lineage. In Hebrews chapter 1 we find a few verses which parrot Psalm 102. It speaks of the eternal nature of God in both passages. In Hebrews, it specifically applies the eternal nature to Jesus, but these are the words it uses to define the quality of God's eternalness. "Thou, Lord, in the beginning didst lay the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the works of thy hands. They will perish, but thou remainest." In the original psalm, it's even more Genesis dependent. "Thou didst found the earth, and the heavens are the work of thy hands. Even they will perish, but thou dost endure." So we see that if we reject a literal reading of Genesis, we lose any meaningful interpretation of many, if not most, or even all, of the supposedly fulfilled prophecies. Much of the reason for the resurrection and ascension story comes from prophecies found in Psalms, and as we've already seen, Psalms relies on the anointed kingship of David for its validity. However, if we overlook that flaw in the foundation, we still find several other problems with the resurrection story. For one thing, it's obviously stolen from Greek, Babylonian, and Egyptian myths, but that is beside the scope of our discussion. The only question that matters for our purposes is, can the story of the resurrection still be believed if we reject a literal reading of the Genesis account? Well, the purpose of the resurrection is redemption, and that doesn't have any meaning without a literal interpretation of the story of the fall of man, but we'll get to that soon enough. For now, let's simply focus on the actual story of the resurrection and ascension. The story is built largely on the significance of certain numbers, specifically the numbers 3 and 40. Jesus spent 40 days in the desert preparing for his ministry. There are 40 days between the resurrection and the ascension. The modern celebration of the resurrection is built around a 40-day Lenten season. Jesus rose on the third day after his death. After the ascension, Jesus joins God the Father and the Holy Spirit to form a Trinity. Numerology is prevalent throughout the Bible, and the significance of certain numbers gives weight to the validity of the concepts. For our purposes, let's examine the significance of the number 40. Frankly, the only reason it's mentioned so emphatically in the resurrection story is because of the significance it has in the Old Testament. And where in the Old Testament is it established as a number of significant heft? In the Genesis account of Noah, that's where. In that story, it rains for 40 days and nights. Noah then waits 40 days more before opening the window. Also in Genesis, we learn that 40 days is the proper length of time to embalm a corpse. Thus, established as a number to be reckoned with, 40 makes several more appearances in the books of Exodus, Samuel, Kings, and several other Old Testament reference points. Yet for the purpose of this discussion, all we need to know is this. If the Genesis account of Noah is rejected, then the event which established the significance of the number 40 goes with it, and the people who gave us a resurrection story and who buttressed it on the impact of that number lose much of their credibility. The Jewish religion from which Christianity sprung was divided at the time into two schools of thought: the Sadducees, who did not believe in resurrection of the body, and the Pharisees, who did believe that the body would be resurrected in the afterlife. The Sadducees saw nothing in the Torah to suggest a bodily resurrection. The Pharisees found justification in the book of Daniel, and many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. So we find that if we remove Genesis from the narrative, we have no reason to consider the number that bolsters the resurrection story to have any merit, and the only basis to believe that the specious belief in bodily resurrection has a foundation in the Godhead of the Jews is a single disputed verse in the book of Daniel. Yet the efficacy of the character Daniel is that he continually keeps to the law of his religion, as laid out in the earlier books stemming from the covenant between God and Abraham in Genesis.